In the bustling heart of classical Athens, a city forever celebrated as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and artistic brilliance, there existed a dark paradox that few like to dwell on. Behind the soaring ideals of freedom and civic equality lay a brutal reality, a deeply entrenched system of slavery. Quick question before we go deeper. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how many places across the world are tuning into this story. And within that system, women bore the heaviest chains. What did it truly mean to live as a a female slave, in a society that praised liberty for citizens yet denied it completely to those bound in servitude? Slavery in Greece was not born in a single stroke of history, nor tied to one conquest alone. Instead, it evolved over centuries, woven into the fabric of trade, war, piracy, and rigid social hierarchies. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had become a society sustained by slavery at every level, its economy and institutions steeped in dependence upon the enslaved. For women in bondage, the dolai, their journeys into captivity often began with violence. They were plunder from war, victims of piracy, or human commodities purchased in sprawling slave markets. Most were foreigners, Thracians, Lydians, Phrygians, or those taken from the shores of the Black Sea. Many were heartbreakingly young, girls torn from their families, stripped of their names, and reduced to nothing more than a price tag. Where male slaves might be sent into the mines, the fields, or into household labor, female slaves were more often subjected to far more intimate and invasive demands. They became domestic attendants, wet nurses for the children of their masters, textile workers in state-run manufactories, or simply bodies to be used and controlled. Their value was not only measured in labor but in obedience, and their very existence was treated as a tool of domination. Writers of the time reveal just how systematic this dehumanization was. In Economicus, Xenophon likened the training of female slaves to the taming of animals, an instruction manual for turning women into docile instruments of service. In Athens, even the most basic protections that free women might have claimed through marriage were denied to them. Female slaves were legally barred from marriage. Any bond they formed, any child they bore, whether by another slave or at the hands of their master, was legally void. Their children were not recognized as citizens. They too were owned, absorbed into the household oikos, and ruled under the authority of the kyrios, the male master. Disobedience or defiance was met with violence, because violence was the mechanism that upheld the entire system. A female slave could be beaten for speaking at the wrong time, for failing in her duties, or for resisting a master's control. This cruelty was not hidden in the shadows. It was normalized, codified into law, and sustained by economic reasoning that treated women as expendable property. The courtroom revealed the same prejudice in its starkest form. An enslaved woman's testimony could not be accepted unless extracted under torture, the infamous practice of basanos. The reasoning was chilling. Slaves, it was believed, could not tell the truth unless forced to through pain. Their voices were considered inherently suspect, their humanity unworthy of trust. Thus, a female slave's reality was life under constant surveillance, violence, and silence, foreign by birth, owned in body, and voiceless under law. And all of this unfolded in the very city that proclaimed itself the defender of liberty. Athens boasted of isonomia, equality before the law, but only for the privileged circle of free male citizens. For the enslaved, and especially for enslaved women, the same public squares that hosted grand debates of philosophy and impassioned political speeches also doubled as theaters of cruelty. Civic spaces were not only arenas of democracy, they could also become stages of punishment, where whipping posts stood as grim reminders of who held power and who had none. Whipping in ancient Athens was not a punishment hidden away in dark corners. It was often carried out in full view of the polis, where control and humiliation merged into one act. It was never only about correcting behavior. It was meant to demonstrate power. Enslaved women could be beaten for disobedience, for failing a task, or even for showing what masters deemed a hint of insolence. These punishments were frequently administered under the eye of a household overseer or a pedagogos, a guardian who supervised slaves. But at times, the lash fell not within the confines of private homes but in public spaces. Punishments could be staged in civic zones, the bustling agora, along the Eridanos River, or outside the noisy workshops where state-owned slaves labored under contracts. These were not neutral sites. They were symbols of Athenian authority, and by turning them into theaters of punishment, masters reminded both the enslaved and the free who held power and where the boundaries of status were drawn. The procedures could be brutal yet regulated. In legal disputes, for instance, if a female slave's testimony was required, the court could order torture as part of the standard process. That often meant flogging carried out under supervision. In Against Oneter, Demosthenes even describes a case where a slave woman's testimony could not be trusted until it was beaten out of her. An unsettling window into how legal structures and violence were inseparably bound together. For enslaved women working in public industries or state-managed establishments, a system institutionalized under Solon's reforms, the danger was constant exposure. The whip, usually a leather strap known as the mastix, became not only an instrument of pain but a symbol of dominance. It appears in vase paintings, casually held by guards and masters, a silent but powerful reminder that violence was woven into everyday life. Public whippings were designed to strip away dignity. They did not stir pity in the onlookers. Instead, they reinforced hierarchy. Pain itself was a declaration of ownership, and the fact that such punishments could take place openly, without fear of legal reprisal or moral outrage, reveals just how thoroughly Athens had normalized slavery. Here was the bitter contradiction. The same society that birthed democracy and praised liberty allowed, and even legitimized, the public torment of those it refused to recognize as human. But whipping was only one layer of this system of dehumanization. Branding with heated bronze tools carried the cruelty even further. To be enslaved in Athens was to live under constant threat of bodily violation, and for many women that threat became permanent, seared into their flesh. Branding was not simply punishment. It was institutional, a mark of ownership carved into the body, a wound that never fully healed. The practice, while not universal, was widespread in contexts where control and identification were crucial. Women forced to work in public bathhouses, state-supervised quarters, or other regulated spaces were especially at risk. They could be marked with heated bronze rods or iron stamps, their skin scorched in open flame. Ancient comedy refers to such marks obliquely, while legal and literary sources confirm the stigma these women carried. The brand was often placed on the forehead, an intentional choice, ensuring it could never be hidden by clothing. Reintegration into free society was rendered impossible. The mark might indicate ownership, profession, or simply their status as enslaved. The branded body was not just owned. It was certified like livestock, visibly cataloged as property. The agony of the process is left unrecorded, because enslaved women were denied voices in the written record. Yet the silence speaks volumes. We can imagine the searing pain, the smell of burned skin, the lifelong scar. Branding was also practical. It made escape nearly futile. Runaway slaves bore marks that made them instantly recognizable. Market inspectors, the politai, were even tasked with checking bodies for such brands during sales, ensuring that enslavement was publicly acknowledged and legally reinforced. For enslaved women in Athens, the whip and the branding iron were not rare punishments. They were daily reminders that their bodies were never their own, living symbols of a society that celebrated freedom for some while enforcing servitude on others with terrifying efficiency. The Athenians themselves did not view branding or seared marks as cruelty, but rather as an administrative necessity, a way to maintain order, to catalog, to control. Yet behind every burned imprint lay an undeniable truth, that in a city which carved its ideals into gleaming marble, it also carved its hierarchies into human flesh. Endless household labor, no legal shield. For countless enslaved women in Athens, the walls of the household, the oikos, were both workplace and prison, sanctuary and cage. Unlike many male slaves who might be sent to fields, mines, workshops, or quarries, women were tethered to the domestic sphere. Their existence was defined not by open space but by suffocating repetition, constant demands, and unrelenting vulnerability. Their days began before dawn, in darkness, and stretched long into the night. The duties were endless. Grinding grain into flour with aching hands, carrying water jars heavy enough to bend the spine, cooking meals over choking smoke, weaving thread until their fingers blistered raw, scrubbing and cleaning the floors that would never stay clean, rocking cradles and tending to children who were never their own, nursing infants at their breast, caring for the sick or the aging. Every corner of the household demanded their labor. Every breath of their day was consumed by work. Xenophon, in his Economicus, describes such roles with unsettling casualness, instructing masters on how to train women slaves in the management of provisions, in spinning, in ordering the home, as though they were no more than animals broken in for service. His words reveal the cold normalization of a system in which human beings were reduced to tools of economy and obedience. But domestic work was not merely exhausting. It was dangerous, carried the constant shadow of discipline. A woman could be reprimanded harshly for a missed task, beaten for an imperfect performance, or verbally humiliated for the smallest error. And in the intimate spaces of household life, kitchens, nurseries, and bedrooms, the line between labor and exploitation often blurred entirely. For female slaves, the threat of personal violation was not abstract. It was a reality they lived with each day, especially in smaller households where oversight was immediate and escape impossible. Isolation only deepened the cruelty. Unlike men who labored in fields or public spaces, enslaved women confined to the household saw little of the outside world. Their universe shrank to the authority of their master, the whims of their mistress, and the company of fellow servants. In this suffocating enclosure, their suffering went largely unseen, hidden behind walls that doubled as cages. And yet, fragments of their voices survive, if only faintly. In the tragedies of Euripides, enslaved women emerge as figures of lamentation, mourning their endless toil and inescapable fate. These lines, filtered through the pen of a free playwright, may only echo faintly the cries of the enslaved, but they hint at the unspoken truth. Athens loved to celebrate its democracy. Citizens filled the agora with speeches, praised the brilliance of isonomia, equality before the law, and held themselves up as the model of freedom. But behind those marble ideals was a darker reality. Inside the household, slavery thrived, and for women in bondage, life was a crucible of relentless exploitation. Their days were not just filled with endless work, but with constant abuse, physical, verbal, emotional, and deeply personal. And their pain wasn't hidden in the shadows of society. It was out in the open, carved into law, echoed in philosophy, staged in Athenian drama, and accepted without shame in daily life. Women were whipped in public squares, branded like livestock, and chained to tasks that consumed their bodies and spirits. Their torment was not an exception. It was the very foundation upon which Athenian freedom rested. So what do we do with this contradiction? A society that sculpted perfection in marble, but erased humanity in people? A city that exalted liberty, but could not imagine it without someone else's chains? Even Aristotle himself reduced slaves to nothing more than living tools. And here's where I want your voice. When you think of Athens, do you see the birthplace of democracy or a society built on hypocrisy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you read this history, because in the end, history forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The very ideals we praise today were born in a world where freedom for some was bought by the suffering of others. And before you go, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Together, we uncover the untold stories that lie beneath the myths. Stay curious, because history is never as simple as the legends we inherit.